Well, hi there, and welcome to a wonderful conversation I'm very much looking forward to. I'd like to welcome to our community, at least to this conversation, because you're very much a big part of our community, Jacqueline Strayer, who's an adjunct assistant professor at NYU School of Professional Studies. Was the former head of communications at Covidian, which many of you may know probably by its new name, or Medtronics, which took the company over. But she has real depth of experience, places like United Technologies, GE, Johnson Controls, etc., where she ran and managed communications functions. She also teaches in other institutions around the country, and most recently was honored to be invited to the World Communications Forum, which is an organization run out of Davos, for a big online forum, and she'll share some of those thoughts with us today. So absolutely delighted to welcome you. I'm Michael Diamond, Academic Director of the Integrated Marketing and Communications Department at the School of Professional Studies. So Jacqueline, I wondered if you could start by just telling us a little bit about what you think we could learn in these times from the past. And I know you've lived through a number of different kinds of crises and are an expert in crisis communications, but you've lived through a lot of different things, different brands. So what lessons have you drawn from the past?
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to share some of my insights here. I've handled crises on the global level as well as regional level for almost my entire career. And I think there are a few that have really stood out in my mind in terms of kind of watershed moments that really enlightened me in terms of crisis response. Notably, I think, during 9/11, I was working at United Technologies, and United Technologies was a large global company. Half the business was in aerospace. And at that time, after 9/11 happened, the markets closed, and when they reopened, the stock went from 78 to 26. And so we had a dramatic change to the market capitalization of the company, and I traveled with the then CEO, George David, as we told employees our realities, what we needed to do. And in that discussion and in that kind of journey during that time, and oh, by the way, a year later, the stock recovered, and 2 years later, the stock split. So it was exemplary leadership in a very difficult time. But what I will say is that I learned the value of not at the same, while you're telling employees the difficulties and the truth about what you're facing, that you have to give employees a reason to believe in the future. You have to give them hope. And in that time, in that very difficult time, that's a lot of what we focused on. And I can recall specifically when we were trying to think of how can we have employees feel pride in their company at such a difficult time. And we used examples of what was going on in the company. And so when the Twin Towers were hit, we brought our Otis repairmen who were in the towers pulling people out of the shafts. And they told their story. And when they needed medical supplies, at the time it was our Sikorsky helicopters that were the first aircraft that were allowed in the air zone around the World Trade Center, and no one knew what they were flying into, and they needed medical personnel and supplies. That gave our people an incredible way of connecting to the great things that their company stood for in the wake of this tragedy. And so through telling their stories, through using examples of what was going on in the company, by examples of their fellow employees, and letting those people tell the stories was really important. And I think also in that, what you learn as a leader in a situation like that oftentimes, while you have to be out there and you have to be confident, and that nothing can replace a confident leader that has experience, that is stable and makes people feel secure. That's incredible. The leader also has to know when to take the back seat and allow employees to come forward and tell the story. And that's what George David allowed to happen. And it was a really remarkable experience and really changed my perspective of crisis response. I've handled crisis response in different parts of the world. I was at Johnson Controls in 2008 during the financial crisis, and we had to close 37 plants and we laid off thousands of employees. Very, very difficult. And I think in that time, we still went out with the whole concept of we had to give employees a reason to believe in the future in spite of the fact that we were facing such difficult challenges.
Right. Do you see, any marked differences with what's going on now where, this is a crisis that seems global, it's happening all at once, it seems very existential, we're talking about life and death, the spread of disease, etc. Is there anything, either perhaps in your observation of brands today and how they're communicating, or your own personal experience, that you think there's the places that you would really step it up, or areas that are different perhaps in the responses we need?
Well, I think that there is so much ambiguity right now with this crisis. I mean, people just don't have the answers. People don't know how long it's going to last. People are afraid of a second wave and a third wave, what that all means. We see hesitancy to reopen, and how do we effectively reopen in a safe environment? So I think that the difference with this particular crisis, first of all, it's much bigger, it's global, it's everywhere, it's ubiquitous. And I think that has an element that puts everybody in some ways on a very equal footing. The fact that we're all worried about our health, we're all worried about our jobs, we're all worried about our futures in a way that is different.
Yep.
I think that in this is where having leadership that is knowledgeable, that is experienced, that is stable and secure is really important for people, so they sense that their organization is being led by somebody who knows what they're doing. That's really important, really, really important now. And in fact, people need to have the ongoing steady stream of communication that lets them know what's going on. It has to be fact-based. It can't be vague, because people in a crisis, and particularly in this one, hang on to every word. So every word matters in terms of how situations are communicated. Organizations are living in, I was just watching the CEOs of Ford and GM talk last night on 60 Minutes, and it was a very interesting conversation in terms of their plants in the US are now making all this, the respirators and the protective gear. And I think that this is a differentiation that we're seeing companies jump in and do different things because of the situation that we're in. But I also think that there is a difference in terms of our concept of a global community. And never have I ever, and I've spent my career traveling the world, lived outside the US several times, and I've never really got the sense of a global community until now, because every person kind of potentially has an impact. And so I think that organizations need to really reinforce the responsibility that organizational members have, not just to the organization, but to their communities, and that leaders have to that as well. And I think that's a difference that we're seeing in this crisis that is different from so many others that we faced.
Right. No, that interesting juxtaposition of how deep the crisis is, but also how emerging out of this, these strong communities seem to be forming, or at least one's sense of being a part of a bigger whole, and how individual components can support the whole. I'm wondering, and we've got a lot of good, rich topics to talk about. I know you're quite involved in the arts and the movies and the theater. I wonder if if you've seen anything there or observe anything there where leadership has taken either a different form or a notable form, or if you think there are some lessons to learn from areas that arguably perhaps are historically more collaborative as business enterprises.
Well, I think right now, like many nonprofits, but especially in the arts, they're really in a very financially strapped way. Many arts organizations have laid off significant portions of their staff and are looking for ways to generate revenue in the face of our reality. I think some of the what has happened, what we've seen particularly in a number of the art sectors is they put a lot of the programming on a remote basis. Some of it you pay, some of it is free. But I also see that there's been a great sense of community that's been engendered by a lot of the arts organizations. I'm on the board of a nonprofit here in Long Island. We've created our own kind of homegrown program you don't pay for it. It's basically a remote film and cooking show where we make a fellow board member who's a restaurateur makes an item from a famous film, and we teach them how to make it. And we also pair it with a film that's, we've had, and they're all family friendly: Ratatouille, Lady and the Tramp, My Big Fat Greek Wedding,
Right.
Big, etc. I think that, that's indicative, that example of what we're doing is indicative of kind of the larger sphere of the arts, is that the arts are really trying to connect to their communities in ways
Yep.
that kind of extend who they are and what they do. I've been extraordinarily impressed with the 92nd Street Y. Every day they send out an email with 92nd Street Y at home. They have lectures from their archive of fantastic people. Just yesterday they had Malcolm Gladwell in conversation. Every day is a great opportunity to learn and grow. And I've actually shared that with a lot of my students who are looking for cultural ways to stay connected to the community, even though they're living in their apartments and can't go outside. So I think the arts and community, whether it's Broadway, whether it's the museums, the Morgan Library is doing some wonderful programming that they send out information on, again, all opportunities for them to extend themselves. I think it's been a learning, it's sort of like, it's not the usual way that we're seeing theater. It's not the usual
Right.
we want to see films. We want to be out. We want to be in person. But I think that they have jumped in and pretty quickly to kind of extend their, their capabilities and their communities with what they do.
Yeah, and there may be some lessons in there about adaptability and flexibility and, reframing what you're offering. I've been in conversation with a number of artists and, teachers of arts who are, teachers in the theater, basically, who are obviously, it's very hard to replicate the kind of instruction around actor training when you only have Zoom. At least if your medium is the theater, not the movies or TV. But at the same time, there's probably a lot of invention and creativity that can be generated in storytelling, notwithstanding. So let's talk a little bit about your experience as a teacher as well, because that's obviously quite central to your life these days. And you're one of our very esteemed colleagues and much loved teachers among the students. So what's your experience been teaching? Did you, let me start with, were you doing a lot of remote or online teaching ahead of the crisis, or was it a big shift for you? And if it was, talk us through that experience and what you've learned, perhaps more broadly, what you've learned.
Yeah, so I've taken a lot of courses myself online. I've never taught a class online. I participated in kind of remote workshops, but no, this was a totally new, an unexpected experience. But, early on when I started doing it, like everybody who was learning to figure out the technology and then how do you really connect, I really focused on kind of how do I actually make the experience of my online classroom better. So whether it's using the breakout, how do I engage students? How do I even know that they're there? They walk away from their computers, all the things that we have to kind of focus on as faculty members. And then I started thinking a little bit more deeply about it, and actually became a much deeper and important kind of internal reflection about teaching. And, I was on a panel a couple of weeks ago, and, I was on a panel with other educators, more experienced than I am, and they were talking about, being effective in the remote environment. And my focus was really more about being effective in this remote environment in this moment. And this moment, we all know, is very different. And so what I found in the classroom is I had to find ways to make myself available to students, because in many situations, I'm very fortunate at NYU to be in a global classroom with students from all over the world, which makes it a richer, more meaningful experience. But also many of them were in isolation from their families. Their families were thousands of miles away. They couldn't leave New York City. They had to stay in their apartments by themselves. Some of them having left their apartments since this remote situation, this lockdown happened. And so I found myself in a place where I had to find ways to not only make myself available, but engage my students to have diversions that would be helpful to them. And so I engaged a number of my students in a volunteer event with my cinema, where we've created this program, and they've done all the marketing, PR, social media, and even editing of these episodes. And it's become a very interesting collaboration outside of the classroom, where they've gotten to know me more as a mentor in terms of the work they do and providing commentary on work product, creating a strategy with them for this, and been an incredibly positive, incredibly powerful experience. I think as faculty members in this situation, we have an enviable role, because we have the opportunity to help beyond the classroom, to either connect with our students. If we see difficulties that people may be having, we can see that, and we need to find ways to help them to seek out sources within the university. NYU we're fortunate because there are a lot of services available to students, and make them aware of what they can get. And I think that's a really, really important responsibility that is different than just teaching in the classroom remote.
Yeah. Well, actually, let's stay on that theme a bit and talk about, how you think students can better prepare themselves right now. We'll talk a little bit more about brands and leaders in a minute, but for the future. But for students, since we're on the topic, what do you think? I mean, I'm making an assumption, which I think is a fair assumption, that it's going to be very challenging for many of our graduates or emerging young professionals generally to find employment, or many, unfortunately, of our alums may be getting laid off, etc. What's your counsel to these folks with respect to what they can do, either to better build their portfolio and their positioning, or invest in themselves generally? So
I think there's some fundamentals, and there's some perhaps differences that people might want to consider. Look, it's no fun to look for a job. Nobody really likes that. I don't know any person in my entire career who said, great, I'm looking for a job, can't wait. It's not exactly the most fun experience. I think, one of the things that I focus on in one of my classes is building relationships and networks, and never has that been more important. So students need to really dig deep and do this process of who is actually in their network that can help them, and then basically reach out to these people. I think many people are really happy to help in any way that they can. And what happens is that once you start reaching out to your network and they start kind of enlarging your sphere to other people in their network, you never know where that may lead. So that's a really important distinction. The second thing is, I can't say enough. I mean, where do most people get found? They get found on their professional profile on LinkedIn. So make sure that that is as meticulously crafted as possible, that, that basically showcases their capabilities. The other thing, and I'm actually writing about this, is I really think that to really stand out, because when you send out your resume into the sometimes seemingly black hole of the internet of online applications, how do you make yourself different? And that's a hard one. But I am a big believer in creating the kind of snapshot video profile, and that each person can create basically a 1-minute profile of themselves that distinguishes who they are, what they've accomplished, and kind of how they could bring value to this particular situation. And it's not a talking head video. It's actually a video where I see the person, and then they take me through their background. We see snapshots of their work. We see snapshots of their accomplishments visually. And in fact, we all know that visual and video is really important in terms of how people pay attention to content. And that would be my strong suggestion. I'm actually going to be leading a workshop on this at NYU this summer with some of my students, because I think it's a profoundly important distinguisher that people should really embrace in this environment, as well as going forward beyond this.
Right. Yeah, so I think that's a brilliant suggestion, the different ways by which you can package and market your talents.
Exactly.
And building a network, continuing to invest in that professional network being the other. What do you think is a useful way to sort of build additional capabilities? Some speakers have encouraged people to study something new. Rashad Tabakawala talks about learn something new in his new book as well, and it's good general advice, or tackle something difficult, which I think is both intellectually stimulating, but also demonstrates that you can take on hard things. What kinds of things do you see people doing, or would you counsel people who are living through this time to sharpen the saw, as they say?
Well, I think the important thing is that people have to be open. They have to be open to the possibility that they may not necessarily be able to get the job in their sector. A lot of my students want to get a job in fashion, they want to get a job in entertainment, they want to get a job in financial services, or different sectors. And I think they have to be open to the possibility that they may have to look elsewhere and in other types of positions. I think it depends on how important it is for somebody to get a job right away, or whether they're willing to wait, whether they're not. So they have to balance that. I also think that if they find that they're short on a specific kind of technical skill requirement that they may need to get, and that may become even more important in this environment, that they need to really kind of address that, and address that quickly and vigorously. Oftentimes people don't want to learn certain things because they don't want to learn certain things, and oftentimes those are the things that may be important for them to know. And I myself am a living example of that. I had to learn things that I didn't necessarily want to do, but had to learn in order to be credible in kind of overseeing certain areas of a function. The other thing that I think that people should not discount is the value of community-based learning, whether you're working for a nonprofit or volunteering in some way, that you can actually get meaningful experience doing that. And in the wake of doing nothing, that is something, and that can build your portfolio. The other thing that I think oftentimes students don't look at, whether it's currently or whether it's over the course of the next semester or two, is as they do their assignments, they should look at each assignment. This is what I tell my students. Each assignment should be looked at as a potential portfolio sample of something they can actually point to that gives them credibility in an area that helps them ultimately get a job. So whether it's what they do their capstone on, whether it's what they do with their paper on, whether they a team assignment, each of these things actually provides an important credential for them that they should use. And if they have had those experiences, they should pull them out and actually present them in a way that gives them proof points to their capabilities as a professional, because those are work products. And even though it may be in an academic environment, they're important work products that they can showcase, that they learned about an industry, that they learned about a particular area of the practice, whatever it is. I think it's really, really important that they not discount what they've actually accomplished over the last couple of years in their studies.
Yeah, that's really profound, sound advice. This idea that not only can you constantly be learning, but that you actually have something to show for it as you go along. That there are ways to harvest even from the toughest times. I think the famous Churchillian quote is, never let a good crisis go to waste. And clearly there are opportunities. I want to go back to one thing you said, maybe use the thought, but then shift it to leadership, which is, you talked about this idea about being open, to new ideas, new directions. The playwright Anna Deavere Smith has this lovely phrase about welcome the unbidden, the things that you didn't really know about that come into your life. Is that true for leaders too? I mean, leaders historically are cast as men or women who, take charge and are very decisive and seem to have all the answers. Is there a new way of thinking about leadership that this crisis has taught us, or, we knew already, we just need to exercise again?
Well, I think that there are some things that are distinguishing in this one because of the ambiguity of the future, the uncertainty of the future. I think some of the best leadership examples that we are seeing of late in this crisis are leaders who are, do all the things that are important in a crisis. They're clear, they're concise, they're compelling, they're frequent, they're transparent. But they also know when they're not the expert. And when they're not the expert, they give the floor, they give the narrative to the person who is. In fact, people will forgive a leader if they make a mistake, if they admit it. And, I think the whole aspect of transparency, I mean, what we've seen in this situation, in this pandemic, is the knowledge that we have of the pandemic is really evolving over time. And some of the things that we thought might have been the case actually have shifted to something else because we just didn't have enough information, or the science became more real. And so I think that what we've learned in this crisis in particular is the importance of leaders, obviously doing all the things that are important during a crisis, but also giving the floor to those who are experts. Look, it's really easy to be a great leader in a good time. When things are going well, it's really wonderful. These are the times that really distinguish great leaders. People that are able to navigate this, expertly with credibility. That is what distinguishes great leadership. And, I talk about this a lot in my classes. I've talked about this in my own leadership capability, in my own leadership experiences. But I really do think that this is really the time when you really see great leaders rise.
And any thoughts of a good example? I mean, you and I have chatted in the past about either different business leaders or political leaders. Any that stand out right now?
Well, I mean, I think I've written about this, and I think the leader that stands out right now is Governor Cuomo. I mean, and just in every measure, this is a person who has jumped into a very, very trying situation with all the attributes that we would hope that he could have, that he has. And in addition to his being, basically out there every day with briefings and telling people the hard truths, but also giving people the hope that, he sees in the future, and the way that, he sees himself as having one job: to serve the people of New York. He's very clear on that. And so any leader, their job is to serve their stakeholders, and he's very clear on who he's serving. So that's really fundamental. In addition to that, he's become a very real human being in this process. I mean, we get to know his family. He brings his daughters on with him. He reads letters that he's written. He just wrote the iconic letter from the farmer from Kansas that he just read, who sent him the COVID the mask for the healthcare worker who needs one in this COVID-19 environment. But I would say that, he is really an example of someone that has distinguished himself on every metric. He's incredibly clear. His words can be understood by everyone. He's very simple, and he's very transparent.
Right. And as you said, listens to the experts as well. I want to shift gears a little bit and think about the future. What we sometimes have been characterizing as the day after tomorrow, and I think it's probably unfair to ask you to predict what consumer behavior will be, because nobody really knows. But I am interested in perhaps what sorts of capabilities you think companies and brands and leaders, more importantly, need to build so that they are aware of what is changing. Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about the qualities of leadership during a crisis, and those things needed to maintain and sustain businesses. But I guess the question to you is, what characterizes businesses and leaders who survive? What did they do well? Or what should we be thinking about now to prepare ourselves for the future?
Well, I mean, that's a complicated question. So let me see if I can kind of unpack a little bit of it. First of all, I think leaders and brands are building, in part, their legacy right now, in terms of how they go forward and how they're being thought of. I have a very strong opinion about how leaders and brands do humanitarian efforts right now, that it cannot be seen as self-serving, that it just has to be seen as the greater good. And that is really an important distinguisher, that you don't try to basically create a narrative of chest pounding that I'm doing this or I'm doing that. And I think that's transparent. I think people will see that, and I think that's important. As organizations go forward, oftentimes we think about what we've lost And we need to think forward in terms of who's still with us and how we have to focus on the future so that we can build our future. And so in that, when organizations have had to, unfortunately, have to lay off employees, and it's very difficult, hopefully some of them can be rehired in the future. But leaders really need to focus on, motivating the survivors currently, and then engaging them going forward in a way that really speaks to the humility as well as their humanitarian focus in this particular situation. I mean, this is unprecedented in terms of how leaders and brands need to think about their kind of global community humanitarian kind of focus. And, organizations have values, and they have stated values, and leaders have values. And we've seen that come into question a lot in the last year in many different situations where organizations sign on to something and then do nothing about it. This is one of those moments where an organization and a leader has stated values. What are they actually doing about it? And then how are they focusing on those values in the future? In addition, leaders need to really scrutinize, and brands need to scrutinize their values going forward. In other words, are these the values that we want to represent ourselves as going forward? Or do we really need to consider what we stand for now in the wake of what we're going through and we expect that we're going to have to be facing when we come out the other side of it? This becomes really an important conversation. And, in addition to doing all your scenario planning of all the things that could be the potential what ifs in an organization that, leaders do in the boardroom, you figure out what are the different aspects of the organization that are going to be affected and what you need to do. They need to really think very strongly about what do they stand for and what are they going to do about that going forward. And that becomes a big part of, I think, the view of the brand, the view of the leader and the organization as a whole.
Do you have any sense, the whole discussion around purpose, obviously, and you and I have talked about this in the past, has become much more current and important since the Business Roundtable put out their statement, and it was discussed heavily at Davos. Arguably, they've been talking about stakeholder capitalism for a long time. But do you think this time will accelerate their effort, change their effort, engage people in a different way? Is purpose now becoming more important, or becoming important in different ways?
I think purpose is important, and I think the words matter, but I think actions are more important. And so I think people need to see tangible evidence of what organizations are actually doing about it. And there's some great examples of organizations that are doing that now, and leaders that are doing, important things in this situation. But I also think that it really, I'm hopeful that the public will demand that of brands, will demand that of leaders, that organizational members and stakeholders will require that. Because I think we need to focus on what we've been through, and when we come out the other side, what did we learn and how are we going to be different as a result of this? That we're not going to just go back to the same old thing, that we will really come out as hopefully a more reflective, a more humanitarian, a more of a global community society. Less selfish, more concerned.
Right. Yeah, I guess for me, I'm trying to weigh up, what we all hope will happen and what we think might actually happen, and
Right.
a concern that we'll very soon revert back to our old ways, and the words perhaps will be a little empty and the promises won't be fulfilled, etc. But the hope, obviously, and I think you're onto something, which is at minimum, perhaps we've increased the likelihood that consumers and employees will demand that of their the companies they buy from or the companies they work for. So that seems more likely than it was 6 months ago.
Well, I mean, there was an interesting article a couple of weeks in the New York Times about the Business Roundtable's revised statement of purpose, which was signed in last August of 2019, and basically it calls into question how committed were those who signed that really to living that. And so I think that what we need to ensure as citizens, as basically global citizens, that people not only say what they mean, but mean what they say, and these stated purposes, values, whatever. I think that's really critical.
Right. Yeah. No, that provides a really interesting build on the movement. I think it's sort of any other kind of interesting areas that you think are being accelerated. Let's say, for example, in how a brand, a company, a leader communicates to his or her publics, its publics, yes, which is at the heart of your professional career and what you teach. And do you see the actual sort of business of the doing of PR changing in some way? And I'm thinking obviously Zoom and video and digital. I mean, it's obviously captured so much of our attention right now.
Well, I think that whether what platforms people choose to communicate on, that could change. I don't know. I do think that the essence of what makes a great leader becomes that much more important in crisis. And so I think in terms of from a communication standpoint, when organizations survive a crisis and they come out of a crisis, it doesn't mean like all better. I mean, it's almost like now the heavy lifting really starts. I mean, really the real work starts, because now we kind of refocus and we got to get people kind of moving forward. And so I think that's actually in some ways the harder work. Because right now we're just in response mode. When you're in a crisis, you're kind of dealing with the crisis and addressing the issues and the questions and the concerns that your stakeholders have. When you come out of the crisis, then you have to kind of re-energize and rebuild. And in some ways, I think, and also reconsider your strategy. So I think that in some ways becomes even more difficult and more time consuming that leaders might actually think about. And in fact, when you have a steady drumbeat during a crisis of communication and content, and people are being kept up to date, and leaders are out there talking to their stakeholder groups and whatever, you can't just kind of move away from that. You have to really understand that there's an expectation that's been created. And while you might not be in the crisis mode anymore, there still is a need to be informed and kept up to date and understand what the realities are of the organization going forward, and basically keep people engaged and hopefully inspired. I think that's important as well.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's a tremendous point, which is the idea of once we get through this, the work is not done, and B, reflecting on the power of what we did to get us through it. Yes, so this, I've been thinking a lot about this idea about building community. I've been quite surprised how powerful the tools available to us, things like Zoom, with Google Hangouts or all these digital tools, which we perhaps didn't avail ourselves enough of before, or felt we didn't need them because we could, all show up in the same room together. But if anything, they've created a platform to enfranchise a lot more people. I'm on a board, up at Yale, and one of the obviously the largest attendance at the board meeting ever was in a recent afternoon, where you could get everybody from around the world, frankly, onto this Zoom call, and it created a real sense of community. And I've seen the same at NYU, gathering faculty together in extraordinary ways, very, very both pragmatic and uplifting ways. So that feels good. I think people have felt like they've done good work together. They've been supportive of each other. They one has to believe that will continue. Why do we all need to get together physically in one room at an inconvenient time? Perhaps we could do that, by Zoom. It may be the refrain in the future, and that would be.
I mean, I think to your point, I think that leaders, if they're not conducting kind of an open Zoom session with their various stakeholders, it's a really important technology or tool to use to engage and be more accessible. I can remember years ago at a company that I worked for, a very large company, And I went out and I did focus groups to find out how did people like to get communicated with, and who did they want to hear information from. And at the time, everybody always said, interestingly enough, oh, people want to hear information from their manager. That's the most credible person. Well, in fact, there had been so much volatility in the organization and so many layoffs. They didn't want to hear from that person because, frankly, they didn't know, number one, if that person would survive, or number two, whether that person even knew. And who they wanted to hear from was the president of the business. So the president of the business started this basically weekly thing where people could call in and ask him questions. So you have the capability with Zoom because right now organizations have been through so much. And in fact, many organizational members or stakeholders, even external, may feel that they really just continue to need to hear from the top person. So that top person going forward and even in the moment need to make themselves available to that, because in many cases, people may feel exactly the way they did in that situation I addressed years ago, which was the leader may be the only person that really knows what's going to happen. And so being accessible and being available is really important, whether it's now or going forward in terms of what organizations do. And I think it's interesting that your board at Yale, he had this most engaged meeting. Now, first of all, that says a lot about the board itself, that people really recognized the situation and came together as a community. And I think that's indicative of how a lot of people are looking at the situation right now, that they want to find ways to connect. They want to find ways to be together. I mean, even from a volunteer standpoint, a lot of these organizations are overflowing with people that want to volunteer because people are looking for ways to actually contribute. And so I think organizations may also find themselves in the happy situations that their employees want to find ways that they can help rebuild this company, help rebuild this organization, find ways that I can be important. I mean, I think that's really also a critical component that needs to be done.
Yeah, and I also think we're exploring, what was sometimes positioned as a sort of dichotomy between centralization and decentralization, or flexibility and rigidity. And, a lot of CMOs and CCOs I've been speaking to have talked about the fact that there's a lot of innovation happening locally, but we're still managing to stay coordinated centrally. Yes. So you're getting the best of both worlds, a strategic, clear, coordinated direction, partly because we're meeting so often with each other, but individual business units, individual teams finding ways to innovate, and then bring it back to the center. And obviously that's always been the promise of large global organizations, is they can do that. I've had people say that they see that going on now in a way that has been accelerated or was different from prior periods. So
what I wanted to point out, though, I think is a really critical point in terms of leadership right now in this situation is this is a time of inclusivity. So you don't want to create the kind of distancing or arrogance that may be seen in leadership at people at certain levels, or basically exclusivity. And I think it's really important for people who are in leadership positions to really get into the trenches, to be connected, to be inclusive, to be real. And I think that they will be well served by that, rather than kind of the ivory tower syndrome of kind of distancing yourself from stakeholders and being remote in that way, mentally remote. I think you have to be basically connected. And I think those organizations that I'm seeing that in are really, really smart, that are finding ways to include people more rather than to exclude people that aren't necessarily, quote unquote, part of their membership or their group. I think that's also an important element in this situation in particular.
Well, I think that's a wonderful note to end on. This notion of inclusiveness and certainly one we would hope will continue. I use, or the term we use a lot at NYU, is this notion of belonging, and I think that's very much perhaps that's the back end of inclusiveness. If you work for an organization that is actively trying to include you, then your feeling is one of belonging. And anyway, I want to thank you personally, as I always, if I get a chance to, thank you for being part of our community and contributing your thoughts today to this discussion. And I look forward to seeing you obviously in person when that chance happens, but also remark on, just the wonderful fluidity of the conversations one can have even online. So many, many thanks. I very much appreciate your time. I'm going to say goodbye for now, and thank you.
Thank you so much.